When we look at a Webquest today, a Webquest is, in a sense, a culmination of a lot of these concepts of transformative pedagogy. It's not necessarily, it's one of those strange ones because it's a good place to start, but it's the best place to end, in the sense that I think it is a good example and illustration of what we mean by changed pedagogy. But at the same time, if this is your starting point when you're trying to integrate technology into your teaching practice, you are definitely going to struggle a little bit, because it's one of those, it's a tricky thing, but it's a very good example of what we want to do. So if nothing else, I hope that this gets you thinking today, and this gets you to have a look at what you've been doing in your class, because ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at how we can improve what we're doing, how we can use technology to enhance education. Remember, it's all about enhancing education and not replacing what we're doing. So when we look at this term, a web quest with Wakelet, the first question we have to ask is, what is a quest? Simple as that. So what is an actual quest? Now, this illustration that you see over here, this whole illustration, is just kind of a depiction of what we might find in a quest. So let's look at some typical elements that we find in a quest. The first thing that we always have in a quest is we'll start with a clue. There needs to be some kind of, it could be a map, it could be a set of instructions, whatever the case is, but when a quest starts, there's always something to set it off, to set it in motion. Then usually quests tend to have some kind of time frame involved. So it's not like you have until the end of the day to solve the quest, because if you don't, someone else will find the treasure, the damsel in distress will be able to get rescued, or whatever the case might be. But there's always a time element involved in a quest. So we'll have a clue, and then we realize, but we have to do it quickly. Then we find the key. So essentially what happens is our clue that we have is able to lead us to the key. Now, the key doesn't need to be a physical key, it can be whatever the case might be, but this is the component that we require in order to finish this quest successfully. We need to find something. So in this instance, we are referring to it as a key. But finding the key on its own isn't usually enough. We need to take a closer look. So once we have this key, we need to ask ourselves, what does this key actually unlock? Where does it go? Where will it take us? What can we do with this key? What is the point of this key in order to actually get ultimately to the treasure? And that's what we want to get to. We want to get to the treasure. So in other words, there's a whole process that needs to be followed. Let me show you quickly what we mean by that. We start with our clue. We realize it's a time-sensitive thing. Then we go and we find our key. We understand what the key means, and then we get to the treasure. But then one of the components in any good quest, and we'll get to this thing at the end, is it's usually better if there's some sort of teamwork involved. Right, so in order to find the treasure, teamwork helps. Teamwork helps for a number of reasons. Teamwork helps because we know that there's limited time. So if we have a team, we can spread our focus and our concentration. If we have a team, we have multiple people who can help us to try and make sense of our key. And ultimately, the team is going to be able to get to the treasure quickest, because they have more resources available. So this is kind of just a basic summary of what we're talking about when we're talking about a quest. But we're here to learn about an educational thing. We're not here to learn about how do we find a treasure. So how does this apply when we start talking about a web quest? So web quest is essentially trying to look at how do we go about digitizing this concept of a quest. So the first thing we have our map, which can be likened to the instructions that we have for a task. So if we don't have clear instructions, then you won't get anywhere with your actual quest. Right? So the next thing that's important is we have to keep in mind there will be a time frame involved. So the time frame is going to be dependent on what the resources are like in your classroom. Whether this is going to be a case of I'm going to learners do a Webquest at home, and we're going to talk about that a bit later, or whether it is that they need to do this Webquest in a classroom environment, whatever the case might be, the time frame is going to have a significant role to play in how this whole Webquest unfolds in terms of what's actually going to end up happening. The second thing is, when we're talking about the keys, now we're talking about the key content and concepts, right? So we've got concepts that we need to explain. We've got certain important elements that we're trying to get across. So those are the keys that we're referring to. And one of the significant things that you have to realize here is a Webquest, one of the main successes of a Webquest is the fact that we are trying to focus on this, the key content concepts. We are trying to help learners to simplify a lot of content into something that is more palatable for them. It's easier for them to access, right? So that's an important element that we need to look at here. Then next, and this for me, if I'm going to be honest, is really where the true value lies. And you'll see what I mean by that later, is analyze and evaluate. So once we've discovered our key content and concepts, as a learner, you are now required to go and analyze and evaluate. So what do you analyze and evaluate? You go and analyze and evaluate the key content. So you are required to make sense of this content. Right. And then last but not least, when we talk about the treasure, what are we referring to? We are referring to some form of assessment. This is an important component that I think is often overlooked and sometimes misunderstood when we talk about assessment. When I talk about assessment, I'm not necessarily talking about marks and a formal assessment and how many marks is this learner going to get. Assessment is, for something like a Webquest, the assessment of the learner the assessment of the activity is just as important as the assessment of the learner. You need to be sure that your activity actually helped, made sense, had a purpose, and wasn't just something the kids busy with. So those are key concepts. If we look at when we looking at how we digitize this quest, and when we talk about digitizing a quest, I mean, we don't even need to really talk about digitization. And that's one of the interesting things about a Webquest. A Webquest is not necessarily about technology. It's more about pedagogy. It's more about a changed way of teaching than it is necessarily using technology. So this is about a different way of approaching the learning process. And when we get to the practical side of things, I think it'll start making a lot more sense. But now, what's the advantage of Webquests? Let's do some good old theory. I'm sure if any teacher worth their salt would have seen Bloom's taxonomy and would have some familiarity with Bloom's taxonomy. Now, one of the things we often talk about is the ultimate goal for Bloom's taxonomy is to try and go up the pyramid, to get to the pinnacle of the pyramid, that point of the pyramid. But the unfortunate reality is very often in what we find ourselves kind of going up, and then we hit the wall, and then we kind of stop over here, right? So we stand in front of a class and we teach. So that's essentially this point that's happening. We teach them a whole bunch of things, and then we start, once we've taught them things, we test them, which, to be completely honest, is usually pretty much on the same level that we're doing it. And then when we get to a slightly higher order questions, we get to maybe these points, right? We get to the fact that we understand the work and we apply the work. But if we go and we look at what we are doing, and remember, a big part of this concept that we have is the ability to have an honest reflection on our own teaching practices. If we look at what, are we necessarily going up to the top of taxonomy? Now, the whole point of wanting to get to the top is when we get to the top, if we've gotten here, then everything that happens below becomes significantly easier. Right, I'm not going to go into a whole lecture on Bloom's taxonomy. I think everyone kind of gets the picture, but what I want to talk about here is what are the advantages of using a Webquest? Well, the advantages of the Webquest is this is how they are learning. That's the primary part of the learning that's happening, is that we get them to get to the point of evaluating and analyzing. Right? I hope other people are seeing something on the screen. It could be your internet connection, Archie. Are the rest of you still getting something on the screen? Okay, Archie, you can just try to reconnect. Mariki, are you also not getting anything? Okay. What I'm going to try and do, just give me a second. I'm going to try and switch internet connections because my connection has been giving a little bit of issue. I hope it's not been that way for the whole presentation. Okay, so just give me a second. I'm just going to try and switch connections quickly. Right, I'm back. I hope you can see something now. Okay, I've just reshared it again. Okay. All right, great stuff. Thank you very much. Let's hope that it holds now. So were you all able to see up until this point? I'll try and edit that out of the recording. Okay, so right, just to get back to what we were talking about, I'm just going to just rewind this very quickly. So we were talking about Bloom's and why, based on Bloom's taxonomy, Webquests are a great thing. We want to get to the top, and Bloom, according to Bloom's, what actually happens, the majority of the learning that happens through a Webquest happens at this point, evaluating and analyzing. And the reason why we say that is what you're essentially doing is you're going to give learners a whole bunch of content. And the requirement is if a Webquest is compiled correctly, they need to look at that content and make sense of it on their own. Not necessarily a teacher that explains it to him, to him or her. They need to go and look at it and evaluate it. They first analyze the content. So there is obviously an element of the others involved. Right, so there's obviously an element of the others involved at understanding, remembering, applying, but our focus is going to be on evaluating and analyzing content, right? These two key areas of learning that will be taking place. And these are areas that when we are standing in front of a classroom and we just give all the information to the learners and they're just writing it down, they're not doing evaluation and analysis of the content. They're just writing it down so that they can eventually remember it and then hopefully understand it and then to a lesser extent apply it. Not often that we get here to the top. So that's why this is a core, one of the real advantages. One of the other advantages is now when we get to the final part of a Webquest, which is essentially the assessment part. And I think this is where Webquests can become either incredibly powerful or get a little bit unstuck. There are different ways of testing a Webquest at the end of the day, but more common ones is that we have learners complete a Webquest and then they do a quiz at the end of this. And that there's nothing wrong with that. The one thing, however, if you do a quiz, you're essentially going to be testing at this level. And remember, I say specifically multiple choice because you want to make it a learner-driven activity. It's one thing I didn't mention specifically is the whole idea of this Webquest, it's very much a learner-focused activity and not a teacher-focused activity. So multiple choice is frankly the easiest because a learner can just go and run through a multiple choice quiz and see whether or not they understood the work. Now, depending on how you set up your Webquest, you might have them get the option of doing that over and over again so that they've got lots of opportunities to run through your multiple choice quiz. But that's, again, that depends on how you want to use it. So that's the one way of doing it. But the problem with this, to a certain extent, and again, it's not a problem as much as we could do it in a different way. We are again moving back to right here at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, operating in this bottom part where we spend too much of our education already. Now, the idea is, the alternative to that is that we move our focus to the top where we require them to actually create something. Now, the concept here focuses on an idea called constructionism. I'm not going to go into any detail into what that is. You're welcome to go look it up. It's kind of similar to constructivism if you are into your theory of learning. It's a little bit different, but it's kind of the same concept. But it's this idea of they taking the information and they are making something with that information. And through the process of having to create something, an actual whatever that might be, I'll show you an example of what I mean by that later. By the process of constructing something, they solidify the information and the content. A very simple practical example of that is in the process of preparing to present this whole concept of a Webquest, I had to go and construct this presentation that you're seeing now. So this presentation is a form of constructionism because I learned about a Webquest by making a presentation on a Webquest. So this is something that we, to certain extents, incorporate into our teaching practice, but not, I think, as much as we sometimes want to. Right, so the key and the magic thing that happens is when we create, in order to be able to be right at the top of the pyramid, you first will require the basic levels in order to get there. If you don't understand the content and you don't remember what you have just read, you won't be able to create anything. If you aren't able to apply, because creating is in a sense the ultimate form of application, you won't be able to apply that content. And of course, when we're creating something, you're not going to go and add everything that you just read into whatever you're creating. So this is where we end up evaluating and analyzing the content and deciding what is important, what are the things that have to be in there, and that forms part of the creation. So in other words, all of our elements of Bloom's taxonomy are required in order to be able to get to this top bit and create. So that's where it becomes exciting. That's where it becomes interesting. Unfortunately, that is also the most challenging Webquest to firstly compile, secondly to just use in a classroom, because the minute that you include that, there are more technicalities involved. There are more soft computer skills necessary. There's a whole bunch of things that come into play when we get there. So maybe not the best idea as a first Webquest, but definitely something you need to keep in the back of your mind. So I've got a simple 4-step approach to a Webquest that I like to keep in mind when I want to build my Webquest. And this is something that, I'll be honest, works quite well on a piece of paper, to plan it out on a piece of paper. I'm a big fan of, obviously I enjoy working on a computer a lot, but I'm also very partial to the idea of writing ideas and things down on a piece of paper, because it just makes life easier. So first and foremost, the learning outcomes have to be in the driving seat. Your learning outcomes are always the most important part of any learning experience. It can't be about the technology. Remember, the whole concept of a Webquest can be done entirely without a computer and offline. It's not about the Webquest, it's about the quest concept. It's about the discovery learning, the experiential learning, and all those things. That's the focus, not the technology. So the learning outcomes have to be the central focus. Secondly, once you decide on the learning outcomes, you need to figure out what are the learning materials that'll get me there. I need to ask myself, what will I use in order to get to my learning outcomes? I need some kind of learning material. Then, because we want to be operating at a higher order in Bloom's, so the learning material we need to find for that outcomes, the compile and structure. I suppose we can break, we're going to break down this compile and structure in the next slide. What I mean by that. So we need to compile and structure the quest aspect. So that's when we start thinking about, okay, so we need some instructions, we need to specify what the learning material is, we need to specify a couple of other things based on that. And then lastly, and this really ties into what we were looking at throughout this entire Tech Hours series, that's the access thing. Because I promise you, if you're going to end up having to spend 10 to 15 minutes figuring out how your kids are going to physically access a Webquest, it's going to fall flat before it can even start. So access is crucial. Make sure everyone can access everything. Not every can access everything. Everyone can access everything. In other words, if you are using resources that you can link to, make sure that anyone can link to them. Make sure that you don't need to go through a process of logging in, etc., to get to certain things. Make sure that access is easy. One-click access, if at all possible, is always the best. Now, I know this is not always possible, but try and do that. Just a tip regarding this access, when we want to access things, use guest mode in Chrome, or I think I call it in private mode in Edge, so that you test the links in a way that you are sure that anyone will be able to access them. Really important. Testing. Always have a look at the learner experience, because that's ultimately the make or break for any tool, is the learner experience. Now, so when I talked about this whole structure thing, we're going to highlight it in red. I think it's appropriate. When I talk about the Webquest, the structure, let's have a look at a basic structure. The structure that we're talking about, first and foremost, there has to be instructions and task setting. So I like to structure any Webquest in 4 categories. There are different ways of structuring them, and it's entirely interchangeable however you want to structure it. But first and foremost, instruction settings. Doesn't matter how you're going to structure your thing. This needs to be clear, and because the idea is you want your learners to be able to do this independently, ideally, you want this to happen without you having to explain things, and it just needs to happen, right? So they need to sit down, read what you have require them to do, and understand what's going on without necessarily having to ask questions. The more they do this kind of thing, the better they become at it, the more comfortable they become at this whole autonomous learning concept. Secondly, then I give all the links to the resources. So then they just bunch together. I'll call it content, resources, links, whatever you want to call it. That's in my second group. My first group, instructions, second group, all the resources. Now the third group, and this is the part that I think sometimes can get a little bit tricky for us, is we need to figure out how we're going to have learners analyze and evaluate the resources themselves. So ultimately, we want them to do that. We want learners to go and first, they're going to find the resources, they're going to discover the resources on their own, this whole experiential learning thing that we talk about. Then we need to include an extra exercise that gets them thinking about the resources, because analyze, evaluate is just a fancy way of saying that they're actually thinking about the resources and comparing them and contrasting them and all of these things. It becomes an active cognitive process, not just oh, there's a bunch of things that I read on a page, but I wonder how that compares to that. And I wonder how this one compares to that one. And why is this like this? And why is this like this? That the critical thinking and critical analysis that's happening of work. So we want that to happen. And when I talk about an exercise here at the end, we're not necessarily referring to an actual tool that you're going to be using. You can, of course, use a tool where you compare and contrast these things depending on what kind of tool you want to use. But very often this is done by having clever guided questions where you require them to think about the resources. That's all. Good in questions that we're going to ask. And then lastly, the final assessment, feedback, reflection. I've given it millions of different names because it can be kind of anything. That's an important part. This assessment, feedback, reflection part. You have to keep in mind that one has to be flexible depending on what we want to do, because this is ultimately this last part. I'm going to highlight it in blue because this last part, all of it comes back to right here in the previous slide are learning outcomes. Ooh, that's not a good one. Right. So this all comes back to our learning outcomes, essentially. Now, if we remember that picture that we saw right in the beginning, this links exactly to that quest, right? All of this that I've got here, the four options that I have, the structure that I have, it's following the quest that I saw depicted on that image. We've got our map and we've got our time, which is going to be part of our instructions. We've got our keys that we are essentially going to find based on what the map tells us where we need to go. Then we can't unlock the treasure chest unless we have been able to see what the keys are. So we need to evaluate and analyze our resources. And then lastly, we get to the treasure chest. So this will tell us how to get to the keys. Having a closer look at the keys will help us understand how we can get here. Now, just the final illustration on this again. So if we go back to our treasure map, and this kind of comes full circle, this is our task setting that we need to do. Here we provide the various resources that the learners need to use. Here we talk about analyzing and evaluating these resources, and we ultimately complete some form of assessment. Now, the one element that I haven't brought into the discussion is the element of collaboration. And I bring up the concept of peer assessment because peer assessment is a very powerful form of collaboration. We're scared to do peer assessment. Sometimes we're worried about what the implications might be. From personal experience, I found once learners become comfortable with peer assessment, because in the beginning it isn't always that successful, but it's like any of these changing methodologies. When we change our pedagogy, when we change our habits, when we change in general, it's sometimes an uncomfortable thing. So we have to be mindful of what that could mean, of that implication. It's challenging for a teacher, but it's just as challenging for learners to have this entirely different way of learning, especially the learners who are a bit older and have gone through quite a bit of education and haven't had this opportunity really to do a lot of peer assessment. And peer assessment, mind you, is not when the teacher stands in front and gives the answers and the kids mark each other's work. That's not real peer assessment. Peer assessment is when learners are critically evaluating each other's work. That's when peer assessment really happens. So when we collaborate, we don't need to have peer assessment necessarily. You can have 3 learners go on this web quest together. And very often, based on the resourcing that we have at our schools, this is kind of what we have to do. Many of our schools only have one computer lab, which is used for many things, and there might only be 20 computers in there. So booking a time slot where I want to go get my kids onto a Webquest, you might not have a computer for every single one of those learners. But that's not a problem, because collaboration is such a powerful thing. If you have these kids that are going through these things together. Now, if you've got multiple devices and you've got collaboration happening, it becomes even better and even more powerful. Sorry, before we jump into Wakelet, just what I wanted to illustrate here with collaboration, because when we have collaboration happening, and if we've got that type of collaboration that we're talking about, the time frames become a lot more manageable, because you can now share the workload. You've got multiple people looking at the map or the instructions. You look at the instructions, you see there's a bunch of things we need to do, divide and conquer. You go read that, you go read that, you go read that, you go read that. And then we are going to go into the various resources, but we don't have only one person going into the resources. All three of them go have a look at different resources. And now we get to possibly one of the most exciting parts of what we could achieve with this whole concept. The three learners compare and evaluate and contrast their findings with each other in order to be able to eventually come to a consensus and complete an assessment. So again, the whole concept of this is all about a different approach to teaching. It's approach where we are learning by doing, experiential learning, discovery learning, all of it's the same thing really. And it's a learner-centered thing. So that's what we're talking about. And I want to just emphasize this again. You can do most of this, actually you can do all of this offline as well. You don't need a computer to change this, to you implement this kind of teaching practice. If you do have a computer, because we are in the business of promoting e-learning here, let's have a look at how we use this program called Wakelet. Now Wakelet itself is actually a pretty straightforward program. It's got a lot of cool little functions built into it. Now, the first thing I want to talk about before we actually start with our new collection. So over here, it says there's an extension. Now, I have tried this extension. There's one for Chrome, there's one for Firefox and for Edge. I've tried this extension, and it's got a bunch of very, very, very useful features in it, but then it does a couple of very, very annoying things as well. You're welcome to try it out. I'm not going to show you what the extension does. If you don't know what extensions are at all, go do a little bit of discovery learning of your own and go ask Google to tell you more about what Chrome extensions actually are. But for my experience, I wasn't wild about using the Wakelet extension. So I had it earlier just to have a look at what it looks like these days, and just removed it quite quickly after that. So a Wakelet itself, we're going to jump straight into the create a new collection. Now, just to explain quickly what Wakelet is and why this is quite a nice tool for creating these web quests. Wakelet is a content curating tool. So what it does is, what it does is you take a bunch of different resources on the internet and you just put it together into one easy to access, palatable resource. You can do the same thing, of course, using a Word document, a PDF, a Google Doc. You can do it in a Google slide. You can do it in a PowerPoint. You can really create a web quest in any platform. So many different platforms, because ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to share a group of links. You can even, if you look at what we did last week with a content creation page, you can build a little Google site where you've got your web quest put on that. But Wakelet does a couple of very nice things, especially if you're going to look at the using it on a mobile. So in other words, using it on a phone or using it on a tablet. Then it does a couple of very nice things. So let's first talk about the layout options. There are 5 different layout options here. So you've got the media option, which is the kind of default most popular one really. Then you've got your column option, your mood board option, your grid option, and your compact option. Now, the reason why I'm going to highlight these two is I recommend you use either the compact for your older learners, I suppose, and the media one as well. So the media one and the compact one are essentially the same. They are very similar. The compact one just takes everything that the media one does and squishes it a little bit. So if you've got a lot of resources, I would suggest using the compact one. If you've only got a couple of resources, 2 or 3, then the media one is nice because the media one will show your pictures a little bit bigger and your videos will be a bit bigger and everything is going to just be a little bit bigger. But it does the same thing. The column one is an option, and I think the column one is an okay option if you know you're going to be using a computer lab. So in other words, this one isn't bad if you know you are going to be doing it in a lab. So in other words, learners are actually going to be working on a computer or a laptop. But if they might be doing it on any kind of mobile device, tablet or cell phone, I don't recommend the column one because it doesn't work that well. If I were to choose a single one of them, start with the media one. It really is the kind of backbone of where this whole thing came from. So we're going to use the media as an option. Now, what happens in Wakelet, it's built using a series of cards. What I mean by cards is you're going to build a bunch of blocks. That's essentially what happens. Let's have a look at our different options. So here are my options of the types of blocks that I can build. You'll see that over here when it says paste any web address, that is kind of the easiest way to work with it. Get a link, copy a link, paste a link. And I'll show you what happens when we do that in a second. But sometimes you want to add text, so that's where we add our text on that first one. So we're going to follow our 4 different instructions. We want to first create the instructions, our 4 different segments that we talked about. So this is going to be our instructions. I want to make sure it's nice and big, so I'm going to say H1 for header 1. H2 is just a smaller one. It doesn't have a lot of functionality in terms of the text, manipulating your text, what it looks like. It's pretty straightforward. So you can make it big, medium, or just normal. That's kind of where your options go. We want to make it nice and big. Instructions. So there's the instructions. Oh, just to show you how we can edit it. So there's my instructions. If I want to edit it, I'm just going to click on this pen, edit. So I just want to write under the instructions, please read all the resources. I'm going to keep it very simple. This is not a perfect example of what we want. So there I say, please read all the resources. Now, if I'm going to continue to use this link here at the top, then everything I'm going to paste is going to go on top. We don't really want that. We want to kind of be working down, except if you're going to start from the bottom up, you can do that as well. So we want to add a new card. I'm going to go plus, and it asks me the exact same thing. If you look that I had here at the top, it has now just replicated that over here. So let's have a look at what happens if I actually paste a link in. So these are going to be my instructions. Please read all the resources. I'll read, watch, whatever we're going to use. So just to show you this quickly, I pre-populated a list of links. This is what I usually do when I create, or what I used to do when I created Webquests, is just to go and find links on the internet beforehand. Or you can do it while you are busy building your Wakelet, but Wakelet is working with a bunch of links. So here I've got 4 links. All that I do, let me show you what happens. So this first one is just some text. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go here and just click there and paste. And it'll immediately pick up what it is. What is this? It's a website. And it'll try and find a relevant link or relevant image over here. So for the Shmoop one, it can't pick up on Shmoop's website the image that it needs to have. So it's just going to have a little blank block over there. Now, if I want to, I can edit that and I can change that image You can upload something, use Giphy, go onto my own library, or not my own library, but whatever, go onto the stock library, which means it searches from Unsplash. So I'm just gonna look for literature. Right, and you'll see there are lots of pictures over here. Actually, they don't. No, yeah, sorry. If you continue scrolling, they'll just give you more. So I'll just take this one, say done. And there I've got a little image for this one. Let me show you what happens if there's an actual existing thing. So it seems I just forgot this one. So I just need to go grab that link quickly. So here's another one that I can have. So now we'll just paste it here at the top, paste the link. It's going to go search the website, see if it can find an image, see if it can find something. So there I have, you'll see it's automatically found the link to SparkNotes. Now, if you've ever gone on SparkNotes, I want to show you what we see on SparkNotes. Normally, this is what the website normally looks like. So there's a whole bunch of text. There's a little advertisement over here. There's things that we don't really want necessarily to have as part of our Webquest. Now, the nice thing about using a Webquest is it's got Immersive Reader built into it. Immersive Reader is the Microsoft product that allows you to essentially strip away all other content and focus purely on the text. So once I've selected these things, it actually gives me the option of just focusing on the website itself. But you can switch, oh, sorry, not the website, focusing on the text, but you can switch between the two. It's very important that once you start playing around with these resources, that you figure out what's going to actually happen, what is actually going to look like in my Wakelet. So there I've got these two texts. Let me show you if I add, for example, a video. So let me just drag this thing over to the side here. I'm going to add a YouTube video quickly. So again, I'll just click on the plus and I'm just going to paste. And then you'll see it's got my video and it actually puts this little video, a preview of the video itself. You can go and if you can change it a little bit, you can change the image if you don't like this. You can change the name of the video, etc. But it's just linking to a video on YouTube. And then I can, for example, give them another one, just various links that I've got here. So this is a link to a Prezi, and you'll see there's a little preview of the thing. Now, I hope you're starting to get the idea of what we're trying to do. We're trying to build something that's going to be a series of resources that the learners evaluate. So I've got my instructions. I'll give them way more detailed instructions here, obviously. And then I'd probably typically put, let me just do this for completeness sake. I'll call this resources. And I'll say done. Right, so I've got my first two parts of my Webquest are in place. I've got my resources. Now let's have a look at how we add some analysis of this. So typically, again, what I said is we're probably just going to use text for this. Create a new little text box, and now we say analysis, evaluation, and I'll just tell them compare the characterization of the main characters in Romeo and Juliet. Very similar. Right. So if you look at the question that I've posed here, I asked them to go and it's a question of analysis and evaluation. So this typically, that last question, what is similar, what is different, what is most important? To explain the intention of this Webquest, I want learners to go and read multiple sources of the same thing. It's all about the characters of Romeo and Juliet. And essentially what they need to do is they need to look at these different, at these characters and then go and ask, how is this one different? How is this explanation of Romeo different than this website's explanation? And what is the same? And based on that, if you go through 4 different sets of analysis on the characters, you will find between the 4 of those things the key characteristics that will pop up across all 4 of them. And those are the key things that we're looking for in the characters. So that's kind of the explanation. Rather than me standing in front of the class and telling them, right, so Romeo, everyone write down, Romeo is a 16-year-old not learner, 16-year-old boy. He's very, he wears his heart on his sleeve, doesn't really think about his decisions, very rash about, etc. Let them go and read about it and discover these traits on their own, but not just from one piece of paper. Let them discover the commonalities, because then it really hits home. This is often, in my opinion, if I look at this last question, this is the most challenging part of putting a Webquest together, is being able to ask this analysis evaluation question. And just take note that what I'm referring to now is maybe grade 9, grade 10 work. But you can take the same concept and you can apply it at a lower grade and a higher grade at a level that you feel is your learners are comfortable with, and maybe not comfortable with, in fact. Maybe something that will get them out of their comfort zone, challenge them a little bit. So now the last part I'm going to get to, I'll add a little label. Let's just have a look at what these other things are, because at the end of the day, the only way to really get to learn what it's like is not by me showcasing it, but by you opening it up and playing around with it. So that one I think is pretty straightforward. In that one, we add an image. Over here, we add a bookmark. I'll explain how that works in a second. Here we can add a PDF. And I'll be honest, this last one, oh yes, these apps. So over here, you are able to connect it to a variety of other sources. You can import files from Google Drive, OneDrive. You can add videos from Adobe Spark. This one's quite cool, this video one. Because it's a Microsoft product, it is linked to Flipgrid. I don't know how many of you might have used Flipgrid, but Flipgrid also allows you to do small screen recordings, or not necessarily screen recordings, just little videos. Flipgrid is all about video content. So if you want to, and you know that your school has a strong enough internet connection, rather than actually adding the text over here, you can have a little video of you saying, hi kids, what you need to do now is you need to go look at these resources and find out what the similarities are. So you can make a little video of yourself. Flipgrid also has what I think is pretty cool. Part of this, when you're recording a quick video for that, you can also add a screen sharing element. So you can layer yourself on top of the video when you're explaining something. So if you want to explain a specific resource as part of your Webquest, then you can add a short little video where you are on top of it and you say, so look at this thing, I'm going to explain that now. But again, go and discover it on your own. I can show you how it works, but it's straightforward enough. It's not going to land home if you don't do the discovery on your own. And I think that, to a certain extent, should also be something that we reflect on when you look at what you might have learned across this entire year of the various e-learning events that you've attended. The things that you learn are the things that you learn on your own. What these sessions are about is to really just get you thinking. And if I've got you thinking, then that is all that we're really trying to achieve. Ultimately, what we want to get to, the bookmarks, sorry, let me explain how the bookmarks work. So the bookmarks are linked to specifically your seems my internet dropped there for a second again. The bookmarks are linked to your to the extension that I spoke about. That's why mine says I have no bookmarks at the moment. Right. So mine says no bookmarks at the moment because my extension has been removed. But what the extension does, the extension allows you that as you are navigating through the internet, you can just click on your Wakelet extension and bookmark things, and bookmark and bookmark. So then when you compile your Wakelet, you just click on bookmark and drag things in from there. It's just a different way of kind of achieving the same thing. So ultimately, the last thing we're looking at, now the internet is misbehaving. I just want to double check, are you still seeing my screen and hearing my audio. Okay, there we go. So the last thing we want to do is we want to look at adding a, I don't know why there are so many gremlins today. The last thing we want to do is we want to get to the assessment part, right? So when we're talking about assessment, there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can do it. And there's also no reason why there should be only one way to do it. The assessment could culminate in multiple things. So just to give you an example, if I want to have something like, I'm just going to add a quiz. So I'm going to add a couple of things here. Let's take an example of a quizzes. And remember when I started, I said the Wakelet is a great thing because it's a place to learn about a changed methodology, but it's also an intimidating place because it's the culmination of all the different things that you've been doing. So now I can add a little quizzes as an example. If you haven't made quizzes or you don't know about it, we have recordings of past sessions that we did on quizzes. You could make a Quizlet. So you'll see some things automatically pull in an image, some things don't. It depends on how the website itself was written. So there's little quizzes. There's a Quizlet that I can use. I can focus on the concept of a, let's do something like this quickly. I can say you need to draw your own character diagram using Miro as an example. And I'm going to take Miro and I'm going to make it a link. And we just use that. This one, for example, they're going to have, right, so there's a little link that I've added for them that they can use. So that would be an example of creationism, where they are physically building their own little reply. You can also, we'll just stop there. So there's a whole bunch of different things you can do there. Quiz them, test them. Something that I also think is an amazing little thing. And if you've got some time, look into this tool, which is one of my favorite tools that's now actually become available, is one called Gimkit. I think that's how they pronounce it, which is a very cool gamification tool. So this is ultimately, it's not similar-ish, I suppose, to like a Kahoot type of thing, but also completely different. You can tell them you've got 30 minutes to go through all the content and the resources, and then you need to join the Gimkit game. And you can join it at any time. It's going to run for 10 minutes. The sooner you can get through the content, the better. But if you don't go through the content and you don't know the content, then you're not going to do well in the game, if that makes sense. So ultimately, we're going to put all of this together. Now, once it's all put together, now we need to look at how do we actually get it out to the people. I have this is Romeo and Juliet characters. If I want to make my whole thing look a little bit prettier, the buttons that I'm looking for are right here at the top. There's one of them, and there's the second one. So the settings one is actually, the settings is not going to make it look prettier. The settings are just your basic things that you need to know about how you can. Sorry, let me just take that away. How you can actually make a copy of this thing. An important one, allow duplicate collections so other people can copy yours. Make a PDF. You could only make a PDF once it's saved. That's why it doesn't tell me export as PDF, etc. Making it look pretty is the button right next to it. So over here, you'll see here are the options where I can change the layout. And then here I've got these two options where I can change the look and feel of this thing a little bit. I'm just going to make it look a little nicer. Add a background image. We'll just choose from the library. Again, let's just look for literature. It's an easy go-to thing when you're compiling these stuff. We'll just have a bunch of old books in the background. Let's add a quick cover image. Again, we'll just choose from the library. Let's see if we find something on Romeo and Juliet. That looks close enough. Right, so once I'm done with this whole thing, I can now share my resource. When you share it, importantly, you need to choose the sharing level: private, unlisted, or public. Now remember, if it's public, anyone can find it, anyone can discover it by searching on the internet for it. So if you want to make it public, it's great. It's actually nice because then other people can also benefit from this Webquest that you've established. So I would really, if you can do it public, fantastic. If you're a little bit hesitant on this, you're still new to this thing and you just want to kind of test the waters first, unlisted is fine. That means if people don't have your link, they can't access it. Now, the link itself, you can share it on all of these different platforms in all of these different ways. I'm not going to go into any detail there. But what I think is very, very useful on Wakelet is the minute that you've made it unlisted, right, the minute you make it unlisted, you can now share it in any of these ways, but very, very useful is you can generate a QR code automatically, which you can then scan with your mobile device to have a look at what this thing is going to look like. Right, so I know we are already on our hour, so I'm just going to wrap it up quickly by showing you what our Webquest will look like ultimately. Let me copy this, and in a new tab, if I were to just paste this, we had a few gremlins. I'm sorry, that's why the time is just catching us a little bit today. So when I open it up, this is what the learners will see. They'll see something that looks like this. So now if they want to go into reading something, they'll click on Romeo and Juliet. It's going to take them to the website. What they can also do is they can click on this very important little thing that disappears if I don't hover over it, read mode. So read mode immediately takes this thing, sorry, let's close it now. Read mode strips it down to something that looks like that, which is very, very nice and very useful for content. So you can see the difference between this and this. I want to have, if I want to control the kind of focus of my learners, this is way more useful. And then I can go even further and I can move it into immersive reader as well, which is something you can explore a little bit on your own. And then just to take you through the rest of our, where's our thing now? No, sorry. Just to take you through the rest of our whole thing. And again, go and explore it. Here's the whole thing. Everything is there. Easy for them to access. You just need to make sure that these parts that I have not explained in any way, shape, or form now are explained a lot better. So again, our session today has the same basic premise as all of our other sessions had. It's about a different way of thinking about learning, understanding that when we talk about technology and how technology can change education, it's not about the tool, it's about the pedagogy around it. The pedagogy is ultimately going to be the reason why a tool is successful or unsuccessful. So I hope that concept landed and that we remember this whole concept of a Webquest. And ultimately, as I said, to go back to this part, it has to be founded on learning outcomes, because that is going to determine whether or not your whole thing is successful.